Hello, I'm Dr. Ashar Kahn. I'm a specialist psychiatrist who is practicing in the neuropsychiatry of ADHD and high-functioning ASD. I'm discussing ADHD and sports, exercise, and the athlete today, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
Phelps with 10 meters left. 3 minutes too good. The crowd roaring. Freeman wins gold.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Precision Hydration's all-new Precision Fuel range, the Physical Performance Show's upcoming live stream featuring UK-based sports dietitian and author Rinny McGregor, and of course, Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course, we do this across a range of our episodes, including interest editions, catch-up episodes, coaches' corners, featured performers, and of course, the very popular expert editions. Now, coming off the back of last week's featured performer episode featuring Australian triathlon legend, winner of the ITU World Cup Series Championship for 2002 and 2003, and winner of over 100 international triathlons, Australian Olympian Greg Bennett, we're jumping this week into an all-important exploration around all things ADHD, sport and exercise. Now, this is a crucial conversation that will impact so many of us, be it coaches, athletes, or the practitioners that tune into this show. You see, some of history's most successful and outstanding iconic sports people are known ADHD sufferers. These include the great Michael Phelps and Michael Jordan. And as you'll learn today, the ADHD brain has an innate ability to hyperfocus. Now, this can serve athletes extremely well. However, with every blessing comes a burden, and that is certainly true for the ADHD brain. During today's conversation, you'll discover the prevalence of ADHD in society, the prevalence, quite interestingly, amongst athletes, and it's high. How to diagnose ADHD, what are the 3 key attributes or characteristics of the ADHD brain. Dr. Ashar Kahn will share around the biology of the ADHD brain and explain why it is that the ADHD brain will always crave dopamine. Dr. Kahn shares around why ADHD brains and sufferers, despite popular opinions by many in their world, are not addicted necessarily to exercise, but rather will display or exhibit addictive behaviours, and why it's important to make that distinction. Dr. Kahn will explain the pros, in addition to being able to hyperfocus, that do come alongside the ADHD brain, but also the cons, if you like. Dr. Kahn will outline why it is that ADHD sufferers so often experience depression and anxiety. Now, I have to admit that when I had the pleasure of sitting with Dr. Ashar Kahn to record this expert edition, my mouth was quite literally on the table, as it felt like Dr. Kahn was reading my mail. Now, as a sports physiotherapist, I often say that we don't treat people's physical pain, we treat athletes' psychology, in the sense that you get an athlete that's injured on the sideline, and it's the anxieties, frustrations, fears that athlete is most burdened by through that injury process. And over the years, I've reflected, as I've discovered more about my own biological makeup, including my ADHD brain, that so many of the patients that I see week in, week out in the consult room at Pogo Physio likely sit somewhere amongst the conversation that we're having today. Now, by way of bio, Dr. Ashar Kahn is a specialist psychiatrist, director and founder of Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic. Dr. Kahn first recognised the vast prevalence of undetected ADHD during his addiction training. In the ensuing years, Dr. Kahn observed similar patterns of lack of recognition, early detection and diagnosis, a one-stop specialist platform for early diagnostic detection and treatment intervention specifically for ADHD, autism or other specific learning disorders. Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic was set up as a novel, unique clinic allowing top experts in neurodevelopmental disorders using a cutting-edge scientific approach in keeping with modern research and international guidelines. Dr. Ashar Kahn is a subspecialist in neurocognitive disorders for children, adolescents and adults, offering expertise in Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, Autism Spectrum Disorders including Aspergers, specific learning deficits, and the dual diagnosis of Neurocognitive Developmental Disorders coexisting with addiction behaviour. This is an expert edition that, pardon the pun, will boggle your mind. So get your pen and paper ready for this exploration with Dr. Ashar Kahn, specialist psychiatrist and founder of Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic on all things ADHD, sport and exercise. Dr. Ashar Kahn, specialist psychiatrist and director of Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Hello, Brad. Thank you for inviting me.
Our deep dive today is on this theme that we're titling ADHD, Exercise and Sport. We've got a bit to cover. Maybe we start with a little bit of your academic background and what led you, Dr. Ashar Kahn, to explore the field of psychiatry, and in particular your clinical specialisation, which is ADHD, ASD, learning disabilities and so much more.
Thanks, Brad. So I have the general psychiatry training from UK, and then I have my specialist qualifications and fellowships from Australia. And in the course of doing my general psychiatry with adults and with children, I had a stint of 3 years where I was fortunate enough to get trained in addiction psychiatry, because addiction is so prevalent in individuals with mental health issues. And when I was doing my addiction psychiatry training stint, I realized the role of brain neurons and wiring and the whole mind-brain-body neurofeedback loop in a manner that made me think about the missed diagnoses of these very, very subtle and fine neurocognitive or neurodevelopmental disorders, which we now see most commonly as ADHD, and perhaps the issues related to our functioning, our everyday life, our executive capacity in people with autistic spectrum disorders. So this is where I started thinking about the uniqueness and the novelty of wiring of these individuals. And when I looked at addiction, I found that while we were treating addiction from a top down, when you actually looked at some of the shared stories of individuals, they were quite smart to start with. And sometimes I found that they were smart, but their results were not reflective of how smart they were. And so I got very interested in looking at the manner in which they evolved and what got them to this stage of addiction. And that kind of started my interest in looking at executive functioning disorders, neurocognitive disorders, how we are shaped by our environment, how we are shaped by diet, sleep, exercise, and not just the influence of early attachment figures and parenting and relationships and so on and so forth. So it all kind of started to come together. What we now call epigenetics is environment, genetics, and the role of our experiences and social experiences as we grow up. So I was fascinated amongst those experiences with the neural makeup of individuals and architecture, because three people with similar level of adversity would turn out to be different. So there is something in the genetics which is shaping their growth and executive functioning in the long run. In a different way, one would become a stock market expert, one would become a real estate person, and a third would become an addict and would continuously seek opioids or cannabis and would have joblessness, relationship issues, where the other two people in the same class would be up there. So this variation is where I started looking, and I realized that there's a high prevalence of these aberrations in the way we are wired. And this was my interest in looking into the neurocognitive disorders, and I found ADHD being there.
And ADHD, Ashar, is so widely known / referred to, but I feel that it's probably poorly understood in terms of what it actually is. Mm-hmm. It feels like at times, from a non-psychiatric point of view, as an allied health professional, that it just feels like a little bit of an over-diagnosis at times from maybe people that aren't trained to make a diagnosis. So the obvious question is, what is ADHD, Ashar, and how does it get diagnosed?
Okay, so ADHD, in its very simple definition, is a disorder primarily genetic, but having, as I said earlier, epigenetic influences, so the role of environment, etc. But it actually it has to do with a neurochemical unique functioning, where there are deficits of certain neurochemicals, i.e., for the purpose of this interview, in particular norepinephrine and dopamine. It is most commonly diagnosed in early childhood or adolescence. It's most commonly is quite persistent as we grow up in adults, and it is primarily has three core features which will need to be established that they were there when somebody was born, which are the impulsivity, the inattentiveness, and what we call problems with inhibition, such as not knowing what to do, when to stop, when to redirect ourselves to something, how to, not lose the priority of life and organization of life, etc. There are many other features, but these three core features are usually a part and parcel of ADD individuals' lives.
So that was impulsivity, inattentiveness, and inhibition.
Inhibition problems or inhibition
problem with
deficits.
Inhibition.
Yes, problems with inhibition. Yeah.
Deficits. And I presume this is on a spectrum. Would that be correct?
I mean, you can call it on a spectrum of severity and a spectrum of the manner in which it affects people, which is then contingent on many other things, people's lifestyles, people's genetic IQ, their social supports. Yes, it kind of presents itself in a various strata of people in different ways, from a mild impact of those symptoms on one area, let's say inattention, as opposed to in another person who has more problems with impulse discontrol, where the anger is the issue. And then it could be on the other spectrum, on the other end, it completely is missed, for instance, in people who are high functioning, but so nobody's picking it up in a standard way in school years and later years, but it actually catches up with you on the other end of the spectrum in life crises, relationships, physical health. In fact, there are some studies by Russell Barkley about how ADD is affecting human mortality, in terms of morbidity, the illness, the suffering, the burden of physical issues. So yes, it can vary, and there are many, many factors involved in how it can present itself. Generally, we don't use the word ADD spectrum because people will mix it up with the Aspergers spectrum and Autism spectrum.
That's interesting, but it does require the three core features to be present for a diagnosis to be made.
At one stage or another, it is a specialist job.
Yeah.
The medical interview is a very thorough interview, which has to establish that the core ADHD features in one way or another were present, and we need to establish it. Because people like you and I and busy people, if you take a snapshot of us, we will be very ADHD throughout our lives. When we're doing our exams or when we are prepping up. I remember you were prepping up for your, your recent race.
Oh, man.
And I was in physio with you, and you were like total ADHD in that moment. So we are all in moments of ADHD. Prior to doing this interview, I was quite ADD according to my daughter this morning. So because I was prepping up, Brad's coming over, etc. So we need to. The art of ADHD diagnosis is to rule out what's not actually ADHD and is probably just ADHD behavior as seen by others. But the actual executive functioning deficits, they will be the core symptoms as per DSM-5 or the general worldwide guidelines have to be established. So you need to rule out things like sleep, diet, all the things that can cause a kind of a false positive ADHD diagnosis, drug taking, etc.
The ADHD and ADD, what's the difference? You hear them sort of both thrown around, and what is the actual difference?
Yeah, look, this has caused a lot of confusion. So really, there's no difference. These terms are used quite interchangeably nowadays. But if you want to know the very basic difference is, as the name suggests, with ADHD, the H or the behavioral symptoms are a little bit more pronounced, mostly seen in children, mostly males. Okay, and these become more impulsive behavioral problems as we grow up. On the other hand, when you have the second type, which is the ADD, it's called the inattentive type. And as the name suggests, the issues are more internally making one person not follow through with things, getting distracted, zoning out, spacing out. And they really don't have as much preponderance of behavioral surge of problems. So for instance, they don't grow up to be as aggressive or as impulsive or get all those troubles, but they internally it's almost an equal burden of struggle with everything that they do, because it's more inattentiveness related struggles.
Yeah, okay, that's
focus, concentration, working hard, putting in hours to get productivity, for 10 minutes, and just fatigue, exhaustion, burnouts. So that's the inattentive variety, whereas usually the ones who get into trouble and get picked up early is the H variety. And that's why boys in younger years are diagnosed 2 or 3 times more often than girls, who kind of wing it.
Even though they may have the inattentive type, the ADD, because it's an internal versus an external manifestation.
Kind of, yeah. The inattentive will have probably slightly higher chance of escaping the net especially if a child is using smartness and intelligence to compensate for the inattentiveness. And that's what happens. That's why we are missing so many people, because our school systems are so easily can be catered to if you're just born smart. And it only catches up with you when things get boring, which is usually high school or a time of transition when you're not going to wing it. There's going to be no smartness or intelligence getting you to escape this one. And when the more boring it gets, the more they start to be challenged and the inattentiveness comes to surface.
Fascinating. Wow, that's so interesting. And just on setting the scene, if you like, before we discuss the management and the role of exercise and how this manifests in athletes, prevalence of this in society, and the average age of diagnosis. Any sort of setting the scene things you could share there, Asha, around this?
So certainly. So. The worldwide average for the prevalence of ADHD in children under 14 lies somewhere in the 4 to 5% margin. However, there are studies which talk about how it's underdiagnosed, and it could be 4 to 8%, and so on. In Australia, Deloitte recently did an audit report for trying to measure in fiscal cost the cost to the government for the burden of undiagnosed ADHD and diagnosed ADHD. And they found that the Australian prevalence was quite conservative in terms of world figures. I think it was around between 3%, I think 4% for children, 4.2% for adults. And I think that normal diagnostic rates are quite conservative and below that in Australia. But so we are in line with the rest of the world, perhaps on the conservative side. According to a CDC study, the last one in US, there were 1.6 million children in US who had ADD. Our estimates suggest that there may be up to 4 to 5% of Australian adults who are undiagnosed ADD because we missed it. There were all these myths about ADD. You grow out of it. It doesn't carry on into mature ages and into adults, etc. So, if the stats are right, then we have probably a floating pool of undiagnosed ADHD adults. Around the million mark to 900,000 mark. I think the federal government is realizing it. I remember a chat by a federal minister, I think it's Greg Hunt. Yeah. So he actually acknowledged that ADD is a big health burden that we haven't looked into in terms of properly diagnosing, especially in adults.
And that is why it's been so difficult to line up your diary for this chat. There's a million people needing your services, Ashar.
I think COVID has done that. I think that the children who got confined to online learning, remember I said to you that they're ducking it because they're winging it, and so with their smartness. But when it comes to online learning, suddenly you have this huge executive challenge of regulating yourself, sticking to a screen, no interactions, time yourself. They love the sleeping in part. All ADDs love to sleep in, but they can't continue to learn from online learning because it requires too much processing power. And they're used to learning in groups, and as I said, so when it comes to and they can't question, there is no interactive stuff, so they don't like the studying part, and they because they're not learning from it, they're just studying, and it all looks very regulated to them, so they get exhausted. And so COVID has done that. Plus, when you look at adults, COVID has taken away all our dopamine supplies, the travels, the tourism industry, the toys that we would buy, limitations on exercise, restrictions, social distancing. We are not fit. We are not able to exercise our fitness the way we want. I don't want to walk on the streets with a mask on and enjoy the walk as I did before. So very, in terms of the limitations and this constant anxiety of what's next. I think it's all brought out a lot of ADD individuals who were otherwise coping because they had channeled their dopaminergic self-regulation through activities, going to office rather than Zoom, going on long drives, traveling, getting away, and just refilling their dopamine and noradrenaline, circuits. And I think by limiting that, COVID has done, a big hit to ADHD, escapees. So I think the pressure on us is very high. I've had so many people, hundreds, if not in thousands, who've called us to actually say that since COVID, I can't, tolerate my child because there's no school, And what's wrong? I thought that this child was good in studies, or an adult where a partner would call and say, I can't stand this one because this one is just yapping and the moods are getting affected, anxieties are high, anger, so all that ADD channeled and regulated symptomatology, is now brewing in our households. And I think that's where the burden of, the burden of health is there now. They're identifying it, they're seeking clarity.
Yeah.
And I think this will get worse because as we don't get all these limitations keep growing, an ADHD brain will always take over and find dopamine no matter what. And if it's not exercise and sports and healthy, things to regulate, it will take you to the not so healthy dopaminergic, routes, which can happen when you get depression, anxiety, fatigue, exhaustion. It's unfortunately in our culture, alcohol, cannabis, amphetamines are short fixes for ADD because they give you the burst of dopamine that you were missing.
You said something profound, an ADHD brain will always find dopamine. Can you just explain what dopamine is and why it's so important to an ADHD individual? An individual with ADHD.
Yeah, so dopamine is one of the founding neurochemicals, or proof of life form. It's an essential neuropeptide, or a kind of a fuel that's released between cells when they talk to one another. Now, it has different functions in different parts of the brain. However, without it, we would have a hard time finding purpose, clarity, make goals, think, experience emotions, and have an awareness which allows us to exist in a manner that we can execute a life as adults in a cohesive way. While it gives us pleasure and it allows us to regulate the moods, on the other hand, it can also inhibit a lot of anger, a lot of impulsivity related outbursts and behaviors which are self-damaging or perhaps risk our standing in society. So it's inhibitory and excitatory in the brain. In a very general way, dopamine also tends to take care of the static of the brain. So when we have signals going in the brain, there are a lot of these signals are irrelevant. There's a lot of white noise in the background. And so if we are getting relevant signals and we are getting irrelevant signals, dopamine takes care of the static of those signals and allows for better thinking, clear consistency, and a capacity to prioritize because of the static going. So it's almost like there's no fog in your head. If you had the static, you'd get tired, you'd be foggy, you'd be dreading doing things, the motivation, the get-go, etc. The other chemical in ADHD, which is very important, is noradrenaline, so we all know about adrenaline and noradrenaline. So it affects cardiovascular system. It affects the balance of our vagal tones as well. It's the vagal nerve tone. So noradrenaline is like it's almost looking at signal quality. So while dopamine in the background is looking at the static, the adrenaline and noradrenaline dyad is actually making sure that all signals are going in a very smooth, clear, manner from one synapse to the another. So it's almost like having a Wi-Fi signal which stays at 5 bars and doesn't become NBN every now and then. So that's what noradrenaline does. So we need to have a balance of these chemicals in our system. And ADHD is when there is a kind of a tectonic shift of this balance, and you have deficiency of one or both of these in different areas of the brain, which studies have shown over the last 20 years or so, and that will result, depending on where the tectonic shift is, wherever the deficiency is, it will affect the brain activity, which will then not function at the level it was supposed to. It will be an under-functioning area or that spot or that part of the brain, and this will show in either your moods, your cognitions, the way we think, or in our behaviors.
Mood, cognitions, or behaviours. I recall it made me smile, Ashar. I think I'd shared somewhere on social media that I'd completed the Ironman triathlon, and your comment was, that'll be enough dopamine for you for 1 year. that comment did stand out. Ashar, let's explore the management of ADHD. In terms of management, and I know this is something you could speak around for all day, for probably 5 or 6 hours, but in general terms, how is ADHD managed? So it's been identified. obviously there's plenty of people that unfortunately will go undiagnosed, but someone's been diagnosed. What are the next sort of steps?
So you have, so remember at the very basics of it, ADHD, as I said to you earlier, is a neurochemical, neurological, developmental, neurogenetically predisposed disorder, right? Which is influenced and shaped by our environment, upbringing, etc. So look at the neurochemical part. So there is a treatment which is around the neurochemical imbalance that we now know happens in ADD, and then it affects different brain parts, in fact brain growth in the long run, and then if it's, with brain growth everything else gets affected. So medications will address the neurochemical aspect of ADD. Then there is the non-pharmacological treatment of ADD. And really, there's no better treatment in this world than psychoeducation and awareness of it. And the modern science of ADD is what we need to be educated with, because there's been so many stigma and myth issues and misconceptions that education, to clarify those myths, that burden of living with something that is deemed as, a disorder of somebody's personality or, somebody's value systems or attributes. It's not that. So we have to first look at the education and undo the stigma, the ignorance, and go back to pure science and look at the last 10,000 to 12,000 research papers over the last 40 years that have now, shown that there is clear biological evidence of wiring issues and a whole variety of them in different areas of the brain. So everything that you do after that from education continues, is the one thing that should continue. And it's not education for the person, but the people who are with the person, the parents of the children, the partners of partners, the children of parents, and vice versa, and etc. And schools, whoever's the stakeholder who's sharing the burden of care, must be coming on board with the precise education required for what is the uniqueness and novelty of this particular child and adult and how it's affecting them. And after that, everything syncs with that. We create plans for the emotional side. If emotional dysregulation is an issue, we look at psychological interventions of various types depending on the mood issue. For instance, anxiety is super prevalent. I've hardly come across somebody who didn't suffer from ADD and didn't have some or another form of anxiety in some stage of their life. So then you look at the emotional issues. Some people, there's I think around 20% prevalence of depression, 18 to 20% prevalence of anxiety. We know that drug addiction is very high. Most common diagnosis in children who are not diagnosed with ADD is the oppositional conduct disorders and oppositional defiant disorders. So they kind of become branded as the nasty, naughty child that nobody wants to manage, and same with adults. Anger management issues start to happen. Relationships, people are going to feel self-esteem corrosion, and self-doubting becomes a huge part of a person's life. They go back to their life and self-doubting, anxiety, avoidance, and therefore frustration, anger, and saying things they don't mean. So we then look at that emotional profile, and we look at treating that, whether it's psychologically plus either antidepressants, anti-anxieties. Then we look at the behavioral profile. I'm just summarizing it, which would be how has this affected him? People get into car accidents. A person with ADD will lose their driving license at least twice in a lifetime. If there's no DUIs, there'll be speeding tickets and so on. So the social, relationships, job losses, trialing one degree, then another degree, then getting bored, then another job, etc. So you're looking at that social, so you formulate the social side, and then you tailor treatment according to that. If there's grief issue, loss issue, I often see families, burnt out, and living in their own silos of burnout and with so much confusion, not knowing why, what happened to this person. So we then create that kind of a socio-emotional profile, and we cater to that, be it, If it's problems in school, there's aggression at school, etc. We then involve the school and we cater to that. So we look at the behavioral, issues, and we do behavioral interventions such as cognitive behavioral therapy. We can do a behavioral profile with a behavioral psychologist for ADDs, such as there's a therapy called ABA. There's a therapy called functional behavioral analysis. So we can do all of those, and then we can do an education profile and see what the struggles are there, and accordingly, then you do the therapies. And at the so these are more social interventions, involving stakeholders, looking at individual education plans, behaviors, how are they being responded to, so creating parenting supports. Parents are often missed, how to deal with this behavior. If a child is angry, it's probably because they have ADD and they're exhausted, so don't push them at that time. So simple things like those, look at the antecedents of certain behaviors, look at rewards, look at positive reframing. And so that is the social part. In relationships, you talk to partners and you say, no, he's just, this is an ADD burnout. They're trying hard, but it's not happening. The third part is obviously the cognitive part, which is then, so you've got the emotional part, social, and then the cognitive part depends. So you can have cognitive, there are many kinds of therapies, but one of the most important ones nowadays is ADHD coaching, which is really good for ADDs because they like the pragmatism, the problem solving. It's like a solution-focused coping enhancement intervention. So the ADHD coach is actually an executive function coach. And you go to them and you say, okay, my biggest problems in life are I'm always running late, I'm always rushing, I'm always, my head is racing, I lose my prioritization, my boss is pissed off, etc., etc. So the ADHD coach will take those set of ADHD behaviors and will work to coach you in what alternatives do you have. First, they will kind of formulate what is ADD and what's not, and then they will give you what evidence-based strategies are best. And it could be simple tweaking. Talk about exercise. I can't do exercise. I can't be motivated. So the ADHD coach will talk to you about delegating time, creating variety, looking at interests, and will perhaps say, look, ADDs work best if it's one-to-one. Okay, so whenever you have a coach or a person who's doing your exercise, you will be motivated better because ADDs get a lot of noradrenaline when there's accountability, or they get dopamine when there is reward. So if there's a good, intelligent coach, they'll work better. So ADHD coaching is very good for cognitive kind of, aspects of ADD. And then you can have many other types of neuropsychologists who do interventions, neurofeedback. There's a lot of complementary therapies. Sleep, for instance, is a chronic problem in these individuals, which makes you so sluggish in the morning. You're never waking up fresh. So we do interventions for sleep. We investigate that, find out there's a very high preponderance of sleep apnea or circadian rhythm problems and physiological sleep problems in ADD because the ADD mind is just active. The problem with ADD mind is the more tired the body is, the mind is more active. The more tired you are and the more bored you are, normally I would want to sleep, but the ADD mind in boredom is just racing. It can't shut down. So you can't have your sleep architecture. So we look at so the point being that you work on a cognitive, emotional, and behavioral framework of pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatments. I probably have kind of dragged this on because I'm an advocate of doing these interventions not in a kind of a very generic way, but looking at all these factors, formulating the uniqueness and the impact of these in every domain for the person and the family and the stakeholders, and then create an intervention customized to that. That's why I gave you a whole 40 books in that last 20 minutes, and you can wake up now, yes.
No, I was not asleep, Ash. I'm frantically writing notes.
It's kind of, no, I'm just kidding.
A few things jumped out there. When the body's tired, the brain can be racing. That's fascinating. I've observed that with certain individuals over the years.
Yeah.
How is that so? Is that a physiological...
Yeah, it is. So remember that we are all interconnected. Everything is setting on a neurofeedback or feedback loop, right? The mind, brain, body. So remember, ADD is basically an aberration or a discrepancy or a deficit in the neural circuit involving noradrenaline and dopamine. Okay, so remember I said to you that a dopamine deficient brain will somehow learn to compensate for the deficiency. It can't allow you to go downhill. So either during the daytime it's going to make you busy, you're going to be chatty, you're going to want to do something, you'll go for a quick run, and you want to do the next 2 minutes, and you'll get your child to do some running exercises so they can do homework, etc., right? But when it comes to the second half of the day, we are a little limited, with those channeling out of, self-coping mechanisms. So, unfortunately, other than alcohol and other substances which allow relief to, to get a person to feel that it numbs myself, the brain has no other choice except to release noradrenaline or adrenaline, because it can't find dopamine anymore, right? So the problem in ADD is in a kind of a nutshell that because of the it's not so regulated, that response, that you kind of get flooded with adrenaline. So adrenaline and noradrenaline and some other amines are very closely linked to dopamine. So it's like not having 98 octane. I'll release some 91 octane or ethanol fuel into your system because I can't find 98 octane, which was running you through the day. Now with your turbo engines, when you get the it's a kind of it's not the best match because it is your reserve fuel, adrenaline and noradrenaline, as it comes to compensate. And that's when the head is going adrenergic. So you go into a threat mode, you go into a DEFCON mode. You must do things and find things. So it pushes you to think, do, or get into things so that you can find pleasure and then novelty again, and at least temporarily get your dopamine back. So it's like a brain is caught up in this kind of a reaction, and in a very reactive way to its own dopamine adrenergic crisis. And then often people, the brain gets tired, and if you have genetic predisposition, the brain says, well, I'm just going to activate your in very simple ways, the anxiety gene predisposition or the depressive gene, and then the adrenaline comes with that. So that's why a lot of people get anxious. They're often seen as fidgety, restless, agitated, not settling. I mean, their partners are saying, what the hell, you're on a date with me? Where are you lost? Forgetful. So that anxiety then becomes activated, and it was served to be activated to feed the drop in dopamine. But now once it's activated. Mental health genetic activation is now there. So now you're dealing with a double whammy of dealing with the anxiety, which was actually supposed to be just adrenaline to compensate for the dopamine.
For the worn out supply of dopamine for the day.
So now you've got permanent supply because please be anxious. And then panic and all of those things. Anxiety is the key to all bad mental health evil, in my view.
Wow. So, and before we move on to exercise, these individuals, is it fair to say that they might need to fall asleep exhausted by...
Correct.
They don't go to sleep restfully.
Correct.
You go to sleep when you're exhausted.
100%. I mean, it's an exhaustive sleep. It's not a refreshing, restoring sleep. And that's why ADD individuals, when they wake up, they're not fresh. They are the children. It's a torture for them. I mean, talk to parents about how, my hat's off to them, how they get an ADD child out of bed, get them dressed, get them into school in time. Those parents, wow. So how they manage this. So they're battling against a neurochemical, unrefreshed, unrestored brain. And just imagine that child then sitting in school from 8:30 till 3 o'clock, not able to move from his seat, not having enough dopamine, and forced to comply with all the structures and routines. So when they come back, just imagine the level of exhaustion from dopamine, everything depletion in them. No wonder they go crazy, when they come home and, and then the parents get, what's wrong? He behaves in school, but he's not behaving at home. So yeah. So it kind of, and that same thing with adults, because in the household you find the depleted part. Coming back to the sleep part, look, one of the theories of sleep is that sleep restoration requires a certain architecture of sleep, certain stages, 5 cycles of sleep architecture. And if you do EEGs, you kind of look for delta waves, which is where brain actually reboots itself. So millions of cells which die every day are kind of reformed or reborn, and they happen at a certain time of a sleep cycle. And when you are sleeping with residue of all days of toxic residue of adrenaline in your system and no dopamine, you're not going to have the perfect sleep architecture. So that brain repair that was supposed to happen doesn't get fully repaired, and so you don't wake up with a firmware update. You are still running on old firmware and bits of the update, like we get on
absolutely.
our... So that, imagine that happening for years, so that will have consequences on a person's mental health, physical health, relationships, social outlook, self-esteem, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So it sounds like it's a lifelong management challenge.
Yeah.
And with it being so many moving parts that can affect it, and life being life, it comes with its challenges, its crises. Just sort of picturing what a challenge it is to steward someone across a whole lifespan successfully.
Absolutely. It's a challenge and it's a burden, because you don't know that you're carrying this burden. So if you knew only, then you could have done something about it. We know that ADHD peaks, into teenage years and 20s, and then it starts to, we believe that it doesn't peak after that, it just plateaus. Is it that it's plateauing, or we adapt to it after taking the hits of it? We recognize that this is who we were, and we just adapt to the new normal without knowing what my best normal was, And if you look at these ADD individuals, whenever they lose jobs, relationships, career choices that they change, and through school years, you'll always find that the observers always said has the potential but does not seem to apply it. They will always be seen as someone who was smarter than what they turned out to be or what their life shows. Even when there's relationship conflict, the partner says he was a good guy, but he really, I can't understand, why this toxicity, why this change in behaviors. There's an unexplained question mark in teachers and observers and parents saying, I know this at the core of it is the sweetest, nicest person. This kid is brilliant. What is wrong? Scaleless mistakes, no time management, no prioritization, such obstinate behaviors, such boisterousness. Where is this coming from? So, yeah, it becomes a lifelong thing. But I think that eventually, the sad news is that some of them will just say, that is me, and will just carry on dealing with that confusion, that self-doubting in their own way. They just adapt. They go through adapting to maladapting to adapting, and then I think you just get tired. When I see a lot of people, especially youngsters in your age group, etc., I tell them, look, there's no diagnosis for this in psychiatric books, but you have what is called a burnout depression. ADDs have this burnout depression where they run out of fuel and motivation. Everything is an effort. So the sadness and despair is not the depression, but it's this motivational depression. I have nothing left in me. Everything is an effort. So that's the struggle in life. The motivation, I think, will stay. The self-doubting, all these things just become latent. I think, but the burden just remains buried. It's there.
You're listening to this expert edition on all things ADHD, exercise and sport, featuring Specialist Psychiatrist, Director, Queensland ADHD Neurosciences Clinic, Dr. Ashar Kahn. Support for today's show comes from the great folk and incredible product range at Precision Hydration. I spoke to Andy Blow from Precision Hydration, co-founder, on the show during Expert Edition episode 234 on all things hydration science, where I was surprised to learn that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to hydration. This is simply because everybody loses a different amount of sweat with a different salt concentration. I got a sweat test through the team at Precision Hydration, and it turned out that I only lose about half the amount that the average athlete loses in their sweat. If you've ever struggled with hydration issues like cramp during long hot sessions, it's worth checking out precisionhydration.com. If you can't get to a test centre like I did, you can take the free online sweat test to get a personal hydration strategy to test in training. And now the team at Precision Hydration are aiming to do for fueling what they've done for hydration by helping you understand how much carbohydrate you need to perform at your best. Take Precision Hydration's quick carb calculator to get a fueling recommendation and then book a free 1-to-1 video consultation with the team to refine your hydration and fueling strategy for your next race. It is so important to know your fueling numbers, and you can use the all-new Precision Fuel 30 gels and Precision Fuel 30 drink mix to ensure you hit your fueling numbers. Each product contains 30 grams of carbohydrates per serving to make it easier for you to keep track of your intake and ensure you're getting enough fuel in to perform at your best during your races and training sessions. Now, as a listener of the Physical Performance Show, you can get 15% off your first order of Precision Hydration electrolytes and the new Precision Fuel range by using the code TPPS at checkout over at precisionhydration.com. Support for today's show also comes from our upcoming live stream event featuring UK-based sports dietitian and author Rinny McGregor, Fueling the Endurance Athlete. This live stream is set for September the 4th, 3 to 6 p.m, Brisbane, Australia time. However, do not despair if you're outside of that time zone. A post-event recording and full copies of the lecture via PDFs will be made available to every registrant. During the live stream, Rinny will cover 4 key learning modules. Rinny will define what exactly we are referring to by endurance athlete. Rinny will debunk common myths around fueling, including why lighter is not always faster. Rinny will outline why it is that we must treat male and female athletes differently. And Rinny will explore the common pitfalls around being in a state of low energy availability. Of course, as per all Physical Performance Show live stream events, there will be a Q&A section as well. To secure your ticket to this upcoming live stream learning opportunity, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Rinny McGregor live stream, and there you can gain access from $49 Australian per registrant. Now, if you are a Physical Performance Show's Learnings member through Patreon, then the good news is access to all of our live stream events, our entire back catalogue, including Dr. Stephen Seiler and Dr. Shona Halson, is yours as a complimentary gift. You can support the show via a Patreon membership from just $5 per month by jumping over to Patreon and searching the Physical Performance Show. And of course, support for today's show comes from Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. If you are an endurance athlete struggling with bone, tendon, or joint-related concerns, our 45-minute online telehealth consultations are an ideal way to help get you back to your physical best. Here's a success story from Sarah, Tasmanian-based recreational competitive triathlete who overcame some persisting bone-related foot pain.
Hey, I'm Sarah. I'm a competitive age group triathlete from Australia, and telehealth 100% works. I did telehealth with Brad for chronic sesamoiditis, and I didn't need any hands-on treatment. I had exercise prescription and load management with my training. And this, along with Brad's expertise and genuine care, got me across my pogo finish line.
Thanks, Sarah. If you'd like a hand with your running-related injury, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. For now, let's jump back with this week's Expert Edition featuring Specialist Psychiatrist, Director and Founder of the Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic, Dr. Ashar Kahn, on all things ADHD, exercise and sport. Ashar, you've been sharing around some of the burden of ADHD. Mm-hmm. I've heard it said that ADHD isn't a diagnosis, it's a gift. Mm-hmm. It's a very sort of loose statement in many ways, but what are some of the... I mean, before we pressed record, you were sharing some of the world's best athletes that everyone would identify. Michael Phelps, Michael Jordan, Justin Gatlin, some outstanding athletes with incredible track records. You know, the best of the best, really. What are some of the manifestations that are helpful with ADHD? Is it a gift or is it a burden? Combination.
Well, I look, I think that I don't think there are any studies or science to support that it's a gift. It's a neurogenetic, neurochemical developmental disorder. Okay, so I think that it can, if you're living with it, and it will depend on who you're with, what your life environment, resources, education. For instance, we know in studies that there's less prevalent burden of ADD in higher socioeconomic classes where parents were not separated as opposed to single separated, parents when a child is raised by one parent. We know socioeconomic earning status, education status, all these things matter in ADD. So really, if Michael Phelps didn't have that mother, who was on his back and was consistent. I mean, then how many people have Michael Phelps type of parents who will dedicate themselves and commit themselves to a one-to-one? Literally, the life is, spent raising a champion. So, plus he was in the U.S., would we have a child in an Australian school, who would go off ADD treatment and would go completely crazy, aggressive, boisterous? I mean, look at Michael Phelps' behaviors, That school tolerated it. They didn't kick him out. They found that he's channeling into water is his medium, and he gets opioids from this. So they cultivated him, right? But how many of our schooling systems are equipped to be tolerant of such outliers, when we are younger? It's such a regulated system that doesn't allow, or doesn't, has no tolerance for these outlying behaviors. You can't go to school and say, I'm off my medications. I mean, the parents will just keep getting letters from school saying not behaving. I mean, I have children getting suspended for, simpler things just because they were intrigued and they wanted to be accepted. They just, did a behavior in the influence of a peer group and they get suspensions. So, we are a very regulated, in a majority, I'm not talking about all schools, we are also, our resources are not the best, our people do a good job, but so not everyone gets a Michael Phelps genius, potential, genetics, frontal cortex, and a mother, okay? And we don't know of the struggles that he went through, the emotional, the cognitive, the social struggles he probably had to face. And I mean, in my opinion, he there's also some sensory issues going on because he felt calm in water. So there's more going on. So I think in the same way, for instance, we take Michael Jordan. So we know that ADD individuals, in order to battle distraction, learn to hyper-focus, right? So I don't know whether I'd like to call it a gift that he became just because he became a champ. It probably was the case that his hyper-focusing capacity made him a great champ. He was able to score and so on, because in those moments in time, he could just kind of completely take out all the noise and go into super focus. That's why ADDs are very good first-line responders. Coaches, paramedics, doctors in emergency department, nurses in emergency, and so on. So pilots, etc. So I think that because the adrenaline pours in to counter the dopamine going down, and it puts you into this hyper-focus mode. And when you have so much adrenaline and you're in a do or die, then your crisis management is better, you learn better, you think better, because now you're in that DEFCON 1 mode of adrenergic survival, because the rest of you is crashing. So once again, your brain is hyper-aroused because it's getting deactivated from ADD, and all you need is environmental cues, something of interest, and stimuli and rewards and the seeking of reward to get you going again. So basically, that's how they perform. But that segment should not be seen as a gift for life, I think, because that talent becomes a gift.
Yes.
But what about the rest of you? You know, all the internal struggles of your life, emotional struggles, people. What if you didn't have that glory? How many of us become Michael Phelps and Jordans?
Wow, that's fascinating, because I mean, you look at people that achieve extraordinary things, you use the word outliers, and clearly everyone identifies a Michael Jordan and a Michael Phelps as history's arguably greatest outliers in sport. They have to see the world differently. They have to experience it differently. They have to think differently. And there's been some good documentary, like The Last Dancer, I think it was called, with Michael Jordan, and I think everyone found that fascinating. But what you just shared, I think, is incredible. In order to battle the distraction that comes with ADHD, that individual learned to hyper-focus. And surely that hyper-focus helps when it comes to highest level of performance in whatever the task. Academics, as you said, first line responders, sports. So what prevalence is there amongst athletes? I mean, there might not be any research around this, Ashar, but would you look at high performing individuals in sport and often suspect that there's elements or diagnosed or undiagnosed ADHD present?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is research. I was just looking at a paper this morning because of you. Because of this interview, where I even found out that in elite athletes, studies have shown that the prevalence could be up to 18 to 20%. I was taken aback by this number because I've, been practicing in the 5 to 6% kind of a zone. So I think another study that I just found had an 8.1%, prevalence up to the age of 19 years in 17 studies. So it's very high kind of prevalences. And I also found that, but in my everyday clinical life, when I see my exercise-loving patients and sport patient, they're usually of that smarter group, and they are using hyper-focus to pull through, to get through to life. Okay, so they're super productive, super sharp, but exercise is regulating them. Sports is regulating them. I see a lot of them. However, at the same time, when you look at studies, they come to me because, as per the science, they have the high level of stress, depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, that while they can block out the distractions during practice and competition with the hyper-focus, nobody has actually measured and studied that hyper-focus part. But that hyper-focus, remember, when life changes and new battles come along, personal life and so on, that person who's been working so hard is going to struggle with the change. When you change this milieu that was sustaining them, when a job changes, relationship changes, they struggle. And that's when I see them at that crux in life where change or crisis has rattled them and ADD catches up with them. And this is where panic, anxiety, depression, and burnout, are the 4 most common symptoms that they experience. And in real life, it's almost always a social impact, relationships and social standing, finances, addiction, etc.
And if exercise is sustaining them, it makes me think of my work as a practicing physiotherapist, where an individual like this sustains an injury, and let's say a bone stress injury, and they cannot run, and without the tools of your training, instinctively that individual's greatest struggle is not going to be the physical pain that they're enduring because of the injury. It's the psychological dysregulation, or whatever the term might be. They struggle, and you can't help but empathise with that being. Before I came to meet you today, there's a superbike champion who had a fairly nasty injury, and he's looking at probably a year or two of recovery, and he's sitting in the wheelchair in the room just with his legs pumping because he's just needing to move. And I thought, wow, this is going to be a long journey. So it really is a great example of how if the exercise is taken away from someone, they really do struggle. Any practical examples of that? Obviously, all patient details are confidential. But any examples of an individual that has exercised all their life and all of a sudden it's taken away, and how that's manifested?
I mean, I've only had 3 2 to 3% probably people who are as professionally athletic and so on. But whenever it probably is the other side that I see people who haven't sustained involvement in exercise because you see exercise is boring. So the ADD brain is not going to be going towards exercise naturally till there is incentive, a good coach, a good motivation, or they have some role modeling.
Rewards?
They have some rewards. That's what incentives. And so the people with ADD actually start to do the exercise when they learn about their ADD. So, oh my God, am I missing out on the world's greatest treatment? So we have amazing studies, amazing brain studies on exercise, and so Kramer started this. I mean, Kramer, I think it was an Illinois study, landmark study, where he showed that if you actually, and this is not in ADD people, but normal people, that if you walk, for 40 minutes or 60, for 3 days a week, for up to 6 months, he actually showed through scans how your brain prefrontal cortex actually changes. It grows, your prefrontal cortex, which is the main target area for ADD as well, where all the dopamine and everything is regulating, all the circuits are coming from there. It's called the CEO of the brain, and it actually shows it grows. There are studies to show that while short-term effects of cardio exercises are better than non-cardio exercises, there's brain actual studies to confirm that amazing stuff happening in there. The synapses are releasing, factors called BDNF, brain, nerve growth factors. Vagal tone is increasing, signals, improve. And in the long term, if you do these things, then the effects are lasting, and they're more not in the neurons and the quality of transmission, but the long-term effect of exercise, actual brain changes happen, actual neurological growth, and kind of the brain recalibrates itself to its optimal best. So in ADD we have enough proof that it should be a first line treatment, and I see people who, because they are suffering, just imagine, I gave you the example to invoke some empathy in you of that child who has to wake up unrefreshed and go through school. What time has he, how will he actually come, and what has he left in him he's just going to go his PlayStation, he's going to do his Fortnite and Minecraft, because he's got nothing left, and all he can do is just play with a joystick and get his dopamine going with a hyper focus and do really well in Fortnite, right?
Yes.
So we have to identify sports during school times and make them very targeted. It's essential, because the child there's nothing left afterwards. Same for an adult with ADD. There's not much left in him when he comes home. And then there's the the non-cardiac exercises, which is like yoga and Tai Chi and so on. So even those are better than nothing. There are some studies also to suggest that the more complex the exercise, which requires more coordination, tasking, shifting attention, scheming, the better the effect on brain growth, actual brain growth and brain stability. So there was a difference between cardiac and non-cardiac. So cardiac are the ones where you perspire, as you know, and then there is the complex and the non-complex, the more coordinated and the non-coordinated. So they also have the higher the complexity, as like people in taekwondo and martial arts and all of that, combined with sports, is going to have much amazing cognitive and executive refresh rate and performance than your standard. But they will also improve. But the more you hit the prefrontal cortex and stimulate the wiring,
Yes.
the better your ADHD beneficial effects will be, the better your brain growth will be.
Wow. So exercise really is a absolutely fundamental,
Huge.
irrefutably important part of ADHD management across the lifespan.
Across the lifespan, as the brain is growing in the first part, so it's really essential, in the first part, because you can shape the brain, the way you want. That there's studies to suggest that in a growing child, and even in adults, ADD affects exercise affects, the part of the brain where all the dread, threat, and fright and fight signals come from, which is where the monoamines or adrenaline is created, locus coeruleus in the brainstem. And they find that children have better eye contact. They don't react, in a hypervigilant way. Yes. They don't frighten easily. They don't startle that easily. And translate that into adults, that means you will be less likely to have road rage if you are exercising, and you're going to be less likely you'll be more tolerant of absorbing. It's actually, all that I'm saying to you is scientifically, proven. John Brady in Harvard has done a lot of work in this. So all of these effects of exercise will continue through lifespan, but it'll be different for a growing child, and perhaps more beneficial because it sets the conditioning, and then different for adults, in terms of relapse prevention of anxiety, all the losses and hits that they take.
You're listening to Dr. Ashar Kahn, Specialist Psychiatrist and Director and Founder of the Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic, on this expert edition on all things ADHD, exercise and sport. If you missed last week's episode, it was a featured performer episode featuring Australian triathlon great Greg Bennett. Greg shared the highs, lows and learnings of his remarkable 28-year professional triathlon career. Highs included clean sweeping the richest triathlon prize purse in history at the Lifetime Fitness Grand Slam in the US, while lows included narrowly missing selection for the Australian Olympic team for the Sydney 2000 triathlon at the Olympic Games. The learnings were fast and furious, and there were some terrific stories thrown into the mix as well. It's been an incredibly popular featured performer episode. Here's a little snippet of my conversation with Greg Bennett from last week's episode.
Success comes to those who, endure just one moment longer. And what I mean by that is this: turn up consistency every single day. Do the hard work. Do the right work is probably better than hard work, because you never know what's just around the corner. Something is better than nothing.
To enjoy the full episode featuring Greg Bennett, be sure to jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy the Physical Performance Show from. You'll find us now also over on YouTube. Whilst there, peruse the archives dating right back to episode 1, featuring surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition guest, Dr. Ashar Kahn, Specialist Psychiatrist, Director of Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic, on all things ADHD, exercise and sport. Ashar, you've shared so generously thus far, and I know there's so many more avenues that we could explore with this. But in bringing it into a few practical tips, thinking about the listenership of this show, which is athletes, coaches, practitioners, maybe going to push you for a top tip for each of those groups. So maybe a top tip for practitioners, and we're not defining what type of practitioner that is, but someone working in the healthcare setting, for assisting people with either diagnosed or perhaps undiagnosed ADHD.
Yeah, look at the. I have not done this to coaches and executives. You guys probably live it and know more about these sciences than I do. But from a very basic clinical perspective, you can help by identifying the individuals, address some of the stigma and the ignorance, because the fear is out there from the confusion. And if you get to know your people, I think you should look at a couple of things, such as, do they, I'm sure that when they come to you in your one-to-ones, there's a lot of catharsis that goes on. I mean, I go, my hairdresser says everyone talks to me and my head is spinning. So when they come to you on that table, they're obviously connected to you. You know them, you know their backgrounds. And if you find that their brilliance is not, and their values and their actual the soul of who they are is not reflected in their life, and that other than exercise, there are not too many self-regulatory outside of that zone. They crash, they struggle. I think it's a good point to think maybe to get to see and see if the family has a history of that. A child is struggling, because ADHD is very neurogenetic. It runs in families in almost 70-80%.
Wow.
So kind of start talking about the concept of ADD, and remember, high functioning ADD people who are high functioners are masking it, and they've got exercise and triathlons and gym work and good diets, so they're regulating it. But you will still see over a period of time that they struggle in applying their best. They're happy with the norm, but there was a best normal that they came to terms with that they never tapped into consistently without effort. So look at those individuals, talk to them. They will almost always have perhaps a very different kind of a profile. Exercise will be a lot more therapeutic for them in their headspace, not just in their physical self.
Yes.
They will talk to you about how their focus, concentration, organizing is contingent on, exercise in a very therapeutic way, kind of over that, threshold where I would get exercise and say, okay, I feel cool and young and, they would actually, you will see that there's a healing effect of exercise on them a bit beyond, which takes them into an optimal zone. And without that, and then imagine them without the coaching and that you give them, that they would crash if it was not in their life. So that's a little kind of a hint that you should look further. And then look at the effort of their life. They're also prone to injuries. They're prone to accidents. They're prone to those sickies. They're prone to time management problems. They'll be the ones running late. They'll be the ones who will be missing out and canceling and then apologizing like crazy. They'll be ones who will be rushing in always in the last minute and have anxiety and saying, sorry, I'm running late. and then they'll be they'll be the ones most apologetic and kindest and nicest, but they'll also be very sensitive in many ways. And that sensitivity does if you have this one-to-one therapeutic relationship with them, you'll find that profile, that they're such nice people, sensitive, if you can talk to them, and the three things to look for: is there a lifelong history of struggles with getting bored because they got inattentive, or is there a history of doing so well but impulsively messing up? Every now and then there are some blips in one or other area of your life and injuring yourself, taking on these drastic ups and downs of life with hyper-excitable zones, impulsively doing things which is completely out of character, and then completely, going into a crash and guilt and what have I done, and, messing up. So a kind of an auto-destruct, self-sabotaging button every now and then that gets activated. Do they go into DEFCON 1s and go into high anxious panic threat modes, So there'll be this very interesting, kind of volatility of sorts, which makes them very interesting as well. They're the world's most interesting people, and then but it is their burden really. So help them out and see that the lifelong patterns of applying yourself to the fullest without effort, or without as much effort, the inattentiveness, the impulsivity, and are they, in the terms of inhibiting themselves, are they able to stop? They know their boundaries. They know what not to say. They know what not to commit to. If you have the three I's of those symptoms, then, and if it's through life, and school reports and others' observations, as I said, show smart, but not showing how, smarter can you be, then you can help that person to go see a specialist and a psychologist. So give them literature from Russell Barkley, one of the easiest literatures to read on YouTube. Russell Barkley has an excellent talk on ADHD transitions, or ADHD and emotions, or ADHD and relationships. So have a look at that talk, or by Edward Hallowell. Amazing YouTube stuff out there. And watch out for the girls and women. They get missed. Remember, 3 guys are getting picked up for 1 girl. So that girl patient of yours, or that client of yours, is going to be a masker. So she's missed. Everyone has missed her because of her apparent functioning. So so remember, she'll be the more inattentive, and she has winged it because she's psychologically learn to people please and conform, and has a higher degree of intellect, to have coped. So it'll be much more difficult, as is with clinicians, to pick up the high functioning female.
Wow. Ashar, and something I must ask, something that I feel, just knowing you personally, you've almost edified me around is my absolute love of exercise and the need to survive with it largely. And it brings up something that I often hear in my work, and that is people being almost criticised for their seeming, they might even say, I cop a bit of flack because I'm addicted to exercise. And they almost feel some sense of shame around it. Speaking to people like you over the years, which has been a real blessing, it's you've helped me as a therapist, practitioner, physio, realise that, well, this can be people's sustenance through life, and it is not to be poo-pooed for for individuals. So, I mean, anything you'd share around that, just liberating the person that maybe thinks, this is a bad thing, I can't stop doing this.
Absolutely. I mean, but you can't, because there is, as I said to you, you're on autopilot. I mean, our mind-brain-body connections are driven by some evolutionary, some genetics, some socially reinforced, some environmental. We are regulated beings, and we have to survive. And so the brain will make you survive. You run, and your heart rate does come down. Your blood pressure does settle. Your breathing rate does go to 12 to 17 a minute, no matter if it's 36, 2 minutes before. So our brain is constantly regulating ourselves, and that's why exercise, one of the best studies is that when they started looking at the role of sports and exercise was they looked at the impact on the vagal nerve, stimulation and conditioning, and they found, wow, exercise, the cord or the wiring that it is connected or plugged in is through the vagal nerve. So vagal nerve is the regulatory nerve, heart rate, cardiovascular, you know the deal, right? Breathing. So exercise is an essential component, ADD or not ADD. I've given you enough evidence today to show its impact on ADD brains, but also non-ADD brains. There's no way that you're going to miss out. But when it comes to ADD, that addictive part that comes in is actually perhaps sustained by a brain trying to salvage your quality of life, giving you adaptive survival skills, allowing you to stay and evolve, because it's the way we are tuned, right? So, I mean, the brain has its own right and wrongs. It has the two parts. One is the logical part, and the other part is the contextual part, which gives you perspective. Without these two talking, you won't have purpose, you won't have values, you won't have goals. So the brain is an amazing piece of 1 to 3 billion wires, and it's constantly doing it. So that addictive capacity is not the addiction that we see. So when ADD people come to me and say, I've been drinking and to regulate myself, or cannabis and whatnot, or workaholism or gambling or pornography, I say to them, that's addictive behavior. That's not addiction as a disease. And they're branded all over the hospitals and everywhere else as addicts, but they're not. But just because it's sports, they won't be branded as addicts because it's a good thing. So part of that addictive behavior is your self-survival, as it is mine to get up and eat or breathe, okay? And so it could be looked at as having an addictive quality. Yes. But then basically you're saying, I'm addicted to surviving, which is kind of,
a good thing.
Yes, it's the most normal thing that you have.
I think you've liberated many listeners out there, Ashar. So thank you. And every guest, finally, Ashar, issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So you can take this into your own expertise and field. But what are you going to challenge listeners to do this week?
I'm going to get them to... It's got to be a physical challenge, is it?
Well, as I say that, I realise the irony in that. you make the challenge what you like.
The physical challenge is that, ask yourself, sit down 90 minutes after your exercise and or sports session, 90 minutes after that, and give yourself a physical challenge of being in a boring place with nothing to do. And 90 minutes later, when the opioids of the exercise and sports will settle, hopefully, not for the lifelong ones because their opioids don't settle, but usually 90 minutes after a morning exercise session, succumb yourself to boredom. Don't move. Close your eyes and see if the mind is not racing. And if the mind is settled and you're enjoying the after effects of the opioid, and you're chilled, and your temperament, the boredom is tolerable, and you're enjoying that mindfulness and the breathing. And if that happens, then you have succeeded in the first home-based trial by to see the first screening step of why is my head racing as soon as my opioids go down. And if you don't move in that time, then that means you have passed the test. But if you move and say, well, screw this, this was a stupid challenge that Ashar gave, and then we have to go back into school reports.
And how long? Yeah, so that's a very practical thing we can all do. How long are we sitting still for? 90 minutes after an exercise
90
session.
minutes afterwards.
We're sitting still for
another 60 minutes.
So we're going to sit still for 60 minutes.
Yes, sir. And if your head is like chilling still, your chronic sport, like lifelong sporties, will still be chilled. So they have a longer, because they've been doing it. I told you that the brain actually changes. Mm-hmm. All parts, cerebellum, amygdala, everything has changed. So there it has to have an advantage, I think.
But can you be doing emails, or you got to sit there and sit still?
No, you can't. You just got to close your eyes
and sit with yourself.
Look, this is not scientifically driven. No. You asked me for a random physical challenge. I think it's a good way of seeing that, why is your head not celebrating what you've just done, despite all the chemicals in your system and so on? Why is your head starting to, why is the worry, what to do next? What have I got to do? What is this boredom? Got to move. I think I'm just messing with you guys. I'm just giving you a self-screen to see, that, by doing that, do look in your life and see, have I had periods like those where I can't sustain, the nothingness of life, and when I do exercise, it changes everything. It takes away my nothingness.
Gives purpose.
But when I come back from exercise and so on, do I go back to nothingness and I can't stand it? So that shouldn't be there. Exercise should be a complement. It should be an add-on. It shouldn't be the only outlet, and that's a sign that there's something else happening when you're not in the sports exercise mode. There's a baseline issue that we have to look at.
Wow. Dr. Ashar Kahn, thank you for sharing so generously. If people want to reach out, engage with you personally, direct a query towards you, what's the best means to do that by?
Oh, I have the best place is my website, which is QANC, Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic, qanc.com.au, and I'm on Google. If you place my name there, you'll find me.
Dr. Ashar Kahn, and we'll link up some of the resources you shared, like those YouTube talks, in the show notes, and all of Dr. Ashar Kahn's details, including the Queensland QANC.com.au website. So Dr. Ashar Kahn, thank you for sharing so well and exploring this concept of ADHD, exercise and sport.
Thank you. Pleasure being here. Thank you, Brad. Much appreciated.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I know and I trust you enjoyed some learnings from today's expert edition. A massive thanks to Dr. Ashar Kahn for hosting me on site at the Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic to record this episode. If you'd like to find out more about ADHD in sport and exercise and how to help the ADHD sufferer, you can jump over to qanc.com.au. That's qanc.com.au. Now, I suspect that many of you will want to share this episode with people in your world, be that coaches, athletes, or fellow practitioners. So thanks in advance for sharing this important information. Thank you also to those leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes. And for the podsies, that's simply a screenshot of the episode you're enjoying at any moment in time, tagging in the show at Physical Performance Show on social media, and we'll reshare those and get a real kick from seeing those go up as well. Another huge shout out to today's show partner, Precision Hydration. Don't forget to jump over and use the code TPPS at checkout to receive 10% off your first order of Precision Hydration's electrolytes or their brand new Precision Fuel range. For those who'd like to support the production of the show, please consider becoming a Physical Performance Show's Learnings member. It's really simple. You can do so over at Patreon. Just search the Physical Performance Show, and there you can pledge your support for the show from just $5 per month, which goes a long way in ensuring this show's quality continues, as does the output week to week. And as a small way of saying thank you for your contribution, we'll grant you complimentary access to all of our back catalogued live stream events and our upcoming live stream events, including September the 4th's live stream event Fueling the Endurance Athlete with UK-based, world-renowned sports dietitian Rinny McGregor, set to be a fantastic learning opportunity. Massive thanks to the great folk, as always, who make this show possible each week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. Now, if you are stuck with an injury, please reach out b.beer@pogophysio.com.au or jump straight online and schedule your 45-minute online telehealth consultation, pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physica Performance Show, it has been a bumper second quarter for the 2021 calendar year. At the time of this episode's release, we are knee-deep in the action of the Tokyo 2020/21 Olympic Games. So it's a good time to press pause and recap on some of the many learnings that have come our way in the last 12 weeks. So get set for next week's episode being a Physical Performance Show catch-up episode. And following that, I'll bring you a wonderful conversation I had with one of my physio researcher heroes, Professor Stuart Warden from Indiana University, on all things preventing bone stress injuries in runners. It is an expert edition you are not going to want to miss. So until next week's episode, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.